Good evening, everybody. I don't know everybody on this Zoom, so just to introduce myself, I'm Simon Birch. I'm chair of Bristol Civic Society. Welcome to everybody. And the connection of Bristol, Bath and ancient Egypt, Egypt on Avon, is quite compelling, so I'm really looking forward to it. I'd like to introduce Aidan Dodson, who's Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol. Aidan, I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell the audience what you're going to be talking about. So over to you for this evening's entertainment.
Right. Okay, good evening, everybody. Nice to have been asked to talk to the Civic Society tonight. And what I want to do is to take you through the various ways in which Bristol and Bath have interacted with ancient Egypt and its manifestations over the past couple of hundred years. And although not somewhere you'd immediately associate with the topic of Egyptology, actually Bristol has played quite an important role in world Egyptology, although perhaps rather by a backdoor route. But I will reveal more. Just as a bit more about my background, I've taught at Bristol University since 1996. I've been professor since 2018. And amongst the things I'm interested in very much is the history of the subject, and also actually local history in Bristol as well, although I came at that rather by a backdoor route when I discovered there was some rather interesting material in Plymouth of all places, which led me back to exploring the world of Quaker Bristol in the 19th century. But some of that I'll also pick up on during the talk tonight. Anyway, so where does the sort of engagement of the Bristol-Bath area with ancient Egypt kick off? Well, it probably kicks off with this gentleman here, Giovanni Battista Belzoni, Italian gentleman who came to the UK to seek his fortune, worked as a circus performer. He was a very, very tall, very strong guy. He also, somewhere along the line, picked up knowledge of hydraulic engineering. And in the 1810s, like quite a few people from Europe, made his way to Egypt to further seek his fortune. Because at this time, Egypt was going through a massive transformation, indeed an attempted industrialization on the part of its then governor. Which didn't actually work, but it did mean that there were a lot of people coming from Europe to Egypt to try and sell ideas and otherwise make their fortunes. And this is Belzoni during his circus days, worked at Sadler's Wells. This is one of his favourite party tricks, which is to lift these people up on an iron frame. But he had brain as well as brawn, and it was the brain on the hydraulic engineering side which took him to Egypt. And this is Muhammad Ali Pasha, the governor of Egypt, which was at that time still part of the Ottoman Empire. But Muhammad Ali was keen to make the country effectively independent, and part of that was this attempt to modernize the country. So by bringing in foreign experts to try and move things on. Because of his position as not exactly a rebel against the Ottoman Empire, but as somebody who wanted to make sure he got as much independence as possible, he was very keen to curry the favour of the great powers, and therefore the consuls general of the great powers in Egypt, this is the British consul general, Henry Salt, they were able to get favours, and a lot of these individuals were also rather energised not only by the prospects of modern Egypt, but also of ancient Egypt. And Salt, for example, although a diplomat, he was also very interested in ancient Egypt and was able to get permits from Muhammad Ali, the Egyptian government, to undertake field work, both by himself, but also using various assistants or agents. And it was in this context that Belzoni, whose hydraulic project had failed, was recruited by Salt to do some work here at the great temple of the Ramesseum, the memorial temple of Ramesses II of the 13th century BC, to recover a stone head. This great one, which is now in the British Museum, then known as the Young Memnon. At this period, people couldn't yet read the Egyptian writing, and therefore a lot of these things were simply given names from classical sources, fanciful ones. In this case, this head had been called the Young Memnon, and Salt had been granted it by Muhammad Ali. The main problem was actually get it out of where it is, because basically the bust as we see it here is about 6 foot tall as it stands, so it's not a small thing at all. And Belzoni was recruited, and he successfully removed it, and in the long term it ended up in the British Museum. In addition to this work, Belzoni then carried on partly on his own for his own benefit, partly for Salt's, and ended up digging in the Valley of the Kings, the valley opposite modern Luxor, in which the kings of Egypt were buried from the 16th century down to the 11th century BC. A number of tombs had been standing open there since antiquity, but Belzoni recognised there were some which must still be buried, and he managed to uncover a number of tombs. Most famously, one which is just where I'm marking on the photograph here, and this is a tomb of Seti I, the father of Ramesses II, who ruled in the early 13th century BC. And it's recognised as probably one of the most important tombs in the whole Valley of the Kings. Belzoni not only excavated it and found a number of objects in it, but also he had the entire tomb copied to scale. So every inch of the interior was copied by an Italian artist called Alessandro Ricci, who'd also doubled as Salt's physician, with the aim, when he got back to the UK, of displaying a model of the tomb along with an exhibition of the objects which Belzoni had found during his time in Egypt. In addition to digging in the Valley of the Kings, he also was the first modern person to enter this pyramid, the second pyramid at Giza, just outside Cairo, over 1,000 years earlier than the tomb of Seti I. And when he got back, he displayed a model of that pyramid, also his model of the Seti I tomb, various other objects, and also some full-size casts of some of the walls of Seti's tomb. So it's one of the first great blockbuster exhibitions. And it was held in this place, the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in London, which had been simply built in the Egyptian style something like a decade earlier on, in the early 19th century. There was something of a vogue for the Egyptian architectural style, and we'll see rather close to home how that impacted things. And therefore, it was an ideal place for Belzoni to hold his show, because although the interior was just a basic Victorian, or in this case Georgian, exhibition hall, it had enough. So the facade really worked very nicely with the exhibition inside. Now, this is a fragment of that model at the bottom there, and this is now in Bristol Museum. So therefore, this becomes possibly one of the earliest links, although it doesn't come to Bristol, the remains of the model, until 1900, and that's something I'll talk a little bit more about. But this is how Belzoni first appears. And also, as well as these items which end up coming to Bristol, Belzoni, material from Belzoni's exhibition then goes on display in Bath in 1821. This is the bill for advertising the exhibition, which was built around these two mummy cases and the mummies which were inside them, plus a whole range of other objects. Now, whether this was actually in any way promoted by Belzoni or by somebody who'd bought items when his original exhibition was dispersed is unclear. Although it does appear that Belzoni's wife may have been a Bristolian. So therefore, there may have been the connection. Unfortunately, all we really know about the exhibition is what this advertising bill says. It clearly features Belzoni, but how far the stuff was actually still his or simply somebody was doing the exhibition based on his name remains unclear. This is one of the mummies. It's a lady of the house, Nessie Khonsu. Lady of the house really effectively means married woman. And this is her background as well. And she lived somewhere around 800 BC originally. And the other coffin belonging to Jed Khonsuf Ankh, he is probably about 200 years more modern than Nessie Khonsu. So these are what was at the core of this exhibition. And these items, with others which came from the same exhibition, ended up being purchased by the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution sometime later in the 19th century. We don't know exactly when, but certainly by the middle of the 19th century, they were there. Interestingly, at the same time as that particular exhibition was being exhibited in Bond Street in Bath, in Milsom Street, there was what appears to have been a rival or a spoiler kind of exhibition going on. Somebody had acquired another mummy in a coffin, and this was on display elsewhere in the city. So if in 1822, if you were into Egyptian material, you had no fewer than 2 exhibitions in Bath to go and observe. This is Milsom Street as it was at that particular time. And this is actually the building in Milsom Street, this one which is now Gap, which is where the rival exhibition was being held. Now, what happened, although we know what happened to the material in the Bond Street exhibition, we have no direct evidence as what happened to the Milsom Street one. However, there is in Bristol Museum today a coffin and a mummy whose origins remain completely unknown. There's nothing in the museum record to say when it was acquired or anything. And one wonders, given that there was a mummy in Bath, there is this mummy of unknown origin in Bristol, whether or not the two might actually be the same. Haven't managed to find out so far. There's nothing about the description of it which allows us to be certain, but it seems a reasonable kind of idea. And this mummy is also the same sort of date as Nessie Khonsu, so about 800, between 800 and 700 BC, roughly. Now, Bristol, its own engagement with ancient Egypt kicks off with the foundation of this institution, which is now Freemasons Hall at the bottom of Park Street, again in the early 1820s. These sorts of institutions for science and art were quite common things around the cities of Great Britain, and quite a few of the modern city museums trace their origins back to this kind of institution, which had a small museum, it held lectures. Basically, it was intended to promoting the great things of the age, science and art. One of the first things which we know was acquired by the institution was this coffin, acquired in 1824, and it was presented by the Chancellor of Bristol Corporation, Thomas Garrard, who gives quite a few things to the institution over the years. When it was acquired by the institution, it had a mummy in it and also a lid. The mummy was unwrapped in 1824 and is now lost. And the lid, unfortunately, was burnt in the 1950s on the grounds of it being riddled with woodworm. Unfortunately, when that happened, nobody realised it was one of the most important coffins in a British collection. It's the only one of this particular design in any British collection and dates to around 1500 BC. So it's significantly older than the other coffins which we've been looking at. 10 years later, more objects had been acquired, and there was a big mummy unwrapping in 1834. And this is a watercolour made directly following the unwrapping having taken place, with the victim of the unwrapping down here at the front, a lady called Ta'iri, who again is around about sort of 700 or so BC. A lot of coffins which were acquired by British collections around this time are of that kind of date, presumably because a number of mass burials had been found in the years prior to that in Egypt, and they were being used, and the items then being sold on to passing travellers. And that actually is the coffin from 10 years earlier, still with its lid on there. This is the only depiction of the whole thing. So when the lid was destroyed in the 1950s, without any photograph or anything being taken. So that mummy comes from this coffin here, which had then had been inside this one. So it's a nest of coffins here. This is another mummy acquired in the 1820s. And this mummy belongs to this nest of coffins over here. And just in the front here is the first Egyptian object ever acquired by the institution, a granite stela acquired in 1823, which is now in Emshed. In fact, it's quite difficult to find. It's actually displayed alongside a Bristol Hercules aero engine. So if you're looking for it, look for that and you'll find the stela underneath it. It was explained to me when Emshed was set up why it was there, but I rather forget what the logic was now. During the unwrapping, these beeswax figures of protective deities were removed from the body cavity. The mummy was later turned into a skeleton and then apparently destroyed in 1906, although a few years ago we found in a cardboard box in the basement of the museum a headless skeleton which had clearly once been a mummy. So we think that destroyed actually simply meant the head probably given to the anatomy department or something, and the rest of it was put in a box. Now, alongside this real Egyptian stuff going on Park Street, we come to the next bit of Egypt in Bristol, which is the suspension bridge. Now, when it was first begun in 1836, or when the original plans were drawn up in the beginning of the decade, it certainly wasn't going to be the fairly austere structure we have today. Now, this is where it all kicks off, when the first sort of request for design is put out. And amongst the bids was that of Brunel. And in his specification, he decided that or at least the specification of the one of his plans which was actually accepted, because Brunel put forward a number of different options for the bridge. He stated that the towers to form an Egyptian gateway, and this is the site where his model is coming from, Dendera, one of the most famous temples in Egypt, although in its current form very late, built in Roman times. During the time the Romans ruled Egypt from 30 BC onwards, they did a lot of rebuilding of Egyptian temples, really as an attempt to sort of show to keep the local populace on side. It does mean, therefore, we have some very well preserved temples which they created. Unfortunately, it meant that they demolished some much nicer older temples to make way for what we have. But Dendera was particularly well regarded in the early 19th century and was used as the basis for quite a few other kinds of Egyptianizing structures. One of the reasons was this particular book by a man called Vivant Denon, who had accompanied Napoleon Bonaparte during his invasion of Egypt in 1798. And his travelogue, illustrated by some very, very nice drawings, became something of a bestseller at that period, including English editions being produced. And therefore, it's probably from this plate here that Brunel probably got his idea for what the towers would look like. And based on that, and here's another example of this kind of gateway, very, very typical Egyptian style, with what we call a torus moulding here and a cavetto cornice up here. And note here that many original Egyptian versions have a winged sun disk, which is one of the standard motifs for Egyptian art, particularly for topping a gateway like this. And so this is what Brunel's original plan was going to be. So the towers would be adorned with these winged sun discs. There would also be on top of the tower a pair of sphinxes, the human-headed lion, which is another iconic piece of Egyptian art and architecture. Now, interestingly, when we look at an early representation of the bridge as it was intended, which we will see, we again see the sphinxes, but rather than, as in here, the sphinx is facing the person who's coming onto the bridge, in this version, the sphinxes are facing in the other direction. So rather than facing the person coming onto the bridge, they are showing their hindquarters to the traveller. Interestingly, around a little bit later on, there was a similar kind of debate over the sphinxes, which were to accompany the Cleopatra's Needle obelisk on the embankment in London, decision which way they should face, from which direction their hindquarters should be viewed. So this looks as though probably there was an ongoing debate over this, and it may not have ever been settled as to which way round they were going to go. Because, as it turned out, the bridge would never be completed in its Egyptianizing form. And here's what I was saying about the Cleopatra's Needle in London. Here we have the sphinxes. They now face there so that the person who approaches that way, but there were arguments for facing it the other direction. So the orientation of sphinxes is quite an interesting little sort of sideline when you're looking at the history of Egyptianizing things in Britain during the 19th century. This is a real sphinx rather than a 19th century imitation of one. This one's in St. Petersburg, but probably the sphinxes on the bridge would have looked remarkably like that had they ever been installed. Alternatively, they might have been one of these rather more debased, sort of quasi-classical ones of the kind on the Royal School of Arts in Edinburgh, similar kind of date. So unfortunately, what we have is simply a fairly rough sketch of these sphinxes, so we're not quite sure whether we'd have had a proper pair of sphinxes or we would have had some one of these rather more debased versions of one. Now, the reason the employment of an Egyptianizing style for the suspension bridge reflects quite a widespread usage of Egyptianizing architecture during the early 19th century. I already mentioned the building of the Egyptian Hall, which Belzoni had his exhibition in. But when you go round the country, you find quite a few other examples. And the southwest is quite rich in surviving examples. Here in Devonport, for example, we have what is now the Oddfellows Hall on the right there in Egyptian style, with this further building in classical style and a very classicizing column next to it. So here is quite an interesting example of how the mix and match architectural style approach being taken in the early 19th century. And there it is. Now it's the Oddfellows Hall. In fact, it's now a bar, but originally a naval and military library in Devonport, 1823. So built exactly at the time when the institution in Bristol is starting to acquire Egyptian material. And probably the most famous of the surviving Egyptianizing buildings in the southwest is the Egyptian house in Penzance. Again, 1836, exactly the sort of time when the suspension bridge is being first planned. And in fact, it's now owned by the Landmark Trust, and you can actually book rooms in this for a holiday. In fact, there's a colleague of mine who's a professor of Egyptology at Basel. She came over to the UK specifically to have a holiday staying in this particular house. The Egyptian stuff is rather debased. It's not really it's not particularly accurate. It's seen through the prism of people who are more used to classical architecture, Gothic architecture, and so on. And so in contrast to the way that a lot of classical buildings were very, very hard-lined, following all the rules, that wasn't so much the case with these Egyptianizing ones, whereas it's more sort of Egyptian-esque, if you like, rather than purely Egyptian in design. Going back to the bridge, so this is how it was visualized when the work started in 1836. But as I'm sure most of you, probably the Bristolians who are watching this lecture will be aware, they soon ran out of money. And for nearly 20 years, the bridge was left in this form. You can see that the core of the Egyptianizing gateways had been created, but nothing was ever done about getting the various items. There was supposed to be metal cladding with depicting the work on the bridge. There would have been the sphinxes and all those kinds of things, but none of that was actually done. And so the whole thing just lay there unfinished for a very, very long time. And when it was resumed and finally completed, there was no attempt on the towers themselves to really complete the original concept. But on the other hand, still you can see there is the cavetto cornice and torus moulding on top of the bridge. And in fact, its Egyptianizing elements are most clear when you look at the toll houses at the Somerset end. The Bristol end, those were demolished in the 1950s and replaced by modern ones, but the original Egyptianizing ones still survive at this end. And these are the old Clifton End ones, they unfortunately now long gone. But it's not only the towers that still are Egyptianizing. The abutments are also conceal the original Egyptianizing plan. And in some ways, there is more of that surviving than actually on the bridge, on the towers themselves. Although it's quite difficult to see. You've got to get up fairly close up and personal to realise quite what's going on here. And here we are. So here we've got the main part of the abutment, and here's that cavetto cornice. Okay, it's fairly basic, but there's no question that this is another manifestation of that original intention to build the Egyptianizing sort of fantasy that was supposed to be the bridge. And so when we just look at, just as a comparison, here we can see the way that in its current form, the form of the bridge reflects the original, the planned Egyptian aspect to it. And also there are a few other places around Bristol where we can see a bit of Egyptianizing architecture. Here, the doors to the Lido are a very heavily stylized, but nevertheless Egyptianizing form, albeit then combined with very typical Victoriana here. And that's the one thing about the Egyptian style of architecture. It never became as common as Gothic or classical, but you still do find it here and there. And it's always worthwhile keeping an eye out. You could sometimes find it in the most unexpected places. Now, while all this is going on with the bridge, the Bristol Institution is carrying on with collecting material, Egyptian, natural history, a huge range of stuff. And it was soon finding that it was outgrowing its premises at the bottom of Park Street. And therefore, at the end of the 1860s, a site was bought at the top of Park Street, and work then began on a new Bristol museum. Mm. And this is it as completed in 1872. You'll recognise it now as being Brown's Restaurant, but it was built as the Bristol Museum, primarily with natural history exhibits. Very little else. The only other major group of material which wasn't natural history, which was on display in this original form of the museum in 1872, was Egyptian. And that's something which you find around a lot, is that Egyptian stuff always was regarded as something to bring people in. And therefore, in spite of the fact that the museum was effectively a natural history museum, space was found on the rear stairs for some Egyptian objects. By no means all of what they had, because by now the collection was pretty large. Unfortunately, I've not managed to find any kind of account which tells me exactly what was on display at this period. Presumably a couple of coffins, possibly that defleshed skeleton, which I was talking about, from the Lady Ta'iri. Don't honestly know, but it was certainly there. Now, the treasurer of the Museum Society, because it was still part of a private entity, was this man, Thomas Pease, who was a Quaker. He was a member of a family originally from much further east, from Darlington. In fact, some of his family were heavily involved in the early promotion of railways in the east of England. But owing to his own poor health, and also the poor health of his wife, he moved to Bristol and initially lived here in this house, Henbury Hill, now long gone and under a housing estate, before having his own house built in Westbury. Here, this is where he was originally, in Henbury Hill, the top end of Westbury. And then he had his own home, his own house built called Coke Bank, just down here, on what is now Falcondale Road. Unfortunately, like a lot of the big houses in Bristol, it was demolished in the 1930s, but that's where it was. And in it, he housed his own Egyptian collections. He'd been to Egypt in the 1840s and was clearly somebody of great interest in ancient Egypt. And that was linked with his position with the Museum Society. This is Coat Bank, the place he had built for him. And he lived there with his collections until his death in 1883. He actually dropped down dead in Quakers Friars Quaker Meeting House, and was buried here in the King's Weston Quaker Burial Ground, which some years ago, when I was doing research on him, we went searching for his grave, and here we found it. We actually had to cut a hole in the turf to actually be able to see his stone, because the whole place had been completely returfed. But I'd come across somebody who'd done a complete map of this particular burial ground, which allowed us to actually identify the location of the grave absolutely precisely. Now, when he died, in his house, alongside his own Egyptian collection, were these two coffins. These actually belonged to the Bristol Institution, but for some reason they had passed to his house. All one can think is that because they were short of space at the new museum, even though they'd moved to a bigger location, it was still short of space, that Pease may have offered to store a couple of the objects from the collection, because as he was an Egyptophile, and these would fit very, very nicely. The problem was, because he died so suddenly, that none of his family realised these actually belonged to the Bristol Institution. He'd remarried not that long before his death and had a new young family, and his widow, Susanna Fry Pease, she's part of the chocolate dynasty, lived on there until 1919. And when she died, nobody realised these didn't actually belong to Thomas Pease's own collection. And as a result, they didn't find their way back into the Bristol collection. Indeed, they were actually offered to Bristol on loan. Bristol refused them through lack of space, which has always been a problem at the Bristol Museum, without even realising they actually owned them in the first place. As a result, they ended up going to Plymouth Museum, where they remain today. And it's been agreed between Bristol and Plymouth that Plymouth can keep them. They're not going to try and recover them after all these years. So that is Coat Bank. That's the home of Thomas Pease. But he wasn't the only person with Egyptological interests who was living in Westbury-on-Trim, because here at the Larches in Eastfield, in Westbury proper, lived a woman named Amelia Blandford Edwards. This is her. And this is the only surviving photograph of the house, the Larches. Unfortunately, it got bombed during the Second World War. Out of all the houses in the street, it was the only one to be hit. And it's always typical, isn't it? It's the house that actually belonged to somebody of historic interest. But its location is marked by a plaque on the wall outside today. Now, Amelia Edwards is possibly one of the most important figures in the whole history of British Egyptology, if not world Egyptology. She was a novelist and travelogue writer, originally born in London, but had moved to Bristol after the death of her parents, and lived the last 30 years of her life here in Westbury. So she was a popular novelist, but also a great travelogue writer. And one year in the 1870s, in 1877, she was originally supposed to be doing a walking holiday in France, which got rained off, and therefore decided, apparently almost on a whim, to go to Egypt instead. Yes, that's the plaque outside the site of her house. Anyway, she went to Egypt and wrote a travelogue, but also got completely transfixed by the country, the subject of Egyptology, and also the fact that there were not adequate resources for the excavation and preservation of its objects. Now, Egypt had had an antiquities service since 1858, one of the first countries in the world to actually have a proper national antiquities organisation. However, it was fairly poorly funded, and there wasn't enough money even for conserving what was above ground, let alone excavation. And so therefore, after she came back from Egypt, published her travelogue, 1,000 Miles Up the Nile, which is still a brilliant read even today. She started campaigning, and in 1882, she succeeded in founding an organisation originally called the Egypt Exploration Fund, later the Egypt Exploration Society from 1919 onwards, which took subscriptions from both Britain and around the world, which we then used to pay for excavations in Egypt. And here are a few early photographs of field work being done. And the EES, as it's normally referred, still exists. It's still the main organising body for field work in Egypt by British teams. And therefore this foundation was of massive importance, because up until then there was no professional Egyptology in Britain. Although there was in other countries, it was not something the government ever wanted to put money into, and therefore it was only by a private enterprise thing as the EES which allowed Britain to break into organised field work in Egypt. The rules from the time when the society was founded through to the 1980s was that the fines from a season's excavations would be divided between the excavator and the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, and the EES would take its share, which it would then distribute to museums in Britain and elsewhere in proportion to subscriptions they had given to pay for the excavations. And as a result of this, Bristol Museum, which continued to subscribe to the EES right until very, very recently, received quite a good share of material from its excavations. The fact that the head of the EES was a Bristolian probably helped a little bit, but certainly that is the origin of a good proportion of the Egyptian material in Bristol Museum today. Amelia was a tireless promoter of Egyptology, but in 1892 she came back from an American tour in very, very poor state. She had breast cancer diagnosed. She also then caught pneumonia, having been supervising the unloading of antiquities from Egypt at Millwall Docks, and died. She was buried in Henbury Churchyard. This is her monument on the right here, along with her longtime companion, Ellen Brasher, who died only a few months before she did, and also the daughter of her companion, who died something like 30 years previously. And in fact, although the obelisk is often sort of held up as being an Egyptian sort of motif for an Egyptologist, actually this obelisk goes back to the burial of her companion's daughter years and years ago. In fact, even before Amelia had even moved to Bristol and before it even thought about Egypt. So it's simply an example of a Victorian obelisk on top of a grave. What is Amelia's, however, is this lying in front of it, which is the so-called ankh, or sign of life, which is very much an ancient Egyptian symbol, and that was placed there after Amelia's burial in the grave. So that's the Amelia bit of it, along with the inscription on this side of the obelisk. The daughter of her companion, her inscriptions on this side, and a companion on that. And in fact, it looks like the whole thing was turned through 90 degrees when the whole thing became, rather than a grave for just one woman, for all three of them. And this is actually where Amelia died, in the Royal Terrace at Weston-super-Mare, where she'd gone to convalesce, but sadly she never actually left alive. With Amelia's death, her estate was donated to University College London to endow the first chair of Egyptology in the United Kingdom. Long after there had been one in France and Germany and other parts of Europe. So Amelia was responsible for really the foundation of professional Egyptology in the UK. And the EES and the University College chair have been crucial to its development over the years. Hence, one can really make a good case for Amelia being probably the most important single individual in the whole history of British Egyptology. And she's a Bristolian. In the meantime, Bristol had acquired a university college in the 1870s, not yet able to award its own degrees, but able to teach at advanced level. And in the 1890s, it recruited this gentleman, Ernest Sibrey, who was a genius at languages. And amongst other things, he taught ancient Egyptian at University College Bristol, and will continue to do so after the University College had transmogrified into Bristol University in 1909. And this is where he lived. He lived in Redland at 48 Manor Park, now a student house, but this is where he once resided. And interestingly enough, all the Egyptologists who've ever worked at Bristol University have all lived at some point in Redland. I used to live in Redland, but I now live in Cotton. Now, the museum continued to grow its collections, increasingly lacking in space, but still acquiring material, Egyptian and non-Egyptian. And here in 1898, Sibrey undertook the first bit of cataloguing of the Egyptian collection. He translated a lot of texts, and his manuscript catalogue is still an important part of the museum records. And here's just an example of it. This is that coffin which I mentioned earlier on as possibly being the one from Milsom Street. Possibly, we don't know. Sibrey was able to identify it as a lady called Iset Weret, and here is just part of his translation, his transcription and translation of some of the texts on it. Now, we're now coming up to 1900, when I mentioned that the material from the model of the tomb of Seti I, which Belzoni had created, came to Bristol. Now, for a long time, it was sort of a mystery as exactly how this stuff appeared. It had been donated by somebody from a school in London in 1900, was all that the museum records said, which seemed very, very odd. Why weren't they donated to the British Museum or some other collection in London if they were being donated by this person from a school in London? And also, how did he get hold of them? It took quite a long time to try and unpick the evidence, but now we do know what the story is. And it all goes back to this lady, Selina Belzoni Tucker, who was the goddaughter of Giovanni Belzoni. And when Giovanni's widow died many years later, Selina was her heir. So basically what seemed to have happened is that Belzoni, who died sadly only a couple of years after the great exhibition of his, he went on expedition to Timbuktu and died of dysentery. The model passed to his widow, and then ultimately passed to Selina. And when she died, also without her own children, the whole lot then passed to a cousin of hers. And it was that cousin's son, who happened to work in London, who was given the job of donating this material to Bristol Museum, as it now was, because the institution had effectively gone bankrupt, and the whole of the museum set up had been taken over by the city in the early 1890s. So this is the gravestone of Selina, and also another a sister who she lived with during the latter part of her life, now in Wilton Road Cemetery in Weston-super-Mare. But as a result of, it's through Selina Belzoni Tucker that the material found its way to Bristol. And so what we have is probably about half, I suppose, of the model from the Piccadilly exhibition. And it's it's really important stuff, because the tomb's been quite badly damaged, both accidentally and on purpose, since Belzoni originally discovered it. So this facsimile copy made by Alessandro Ricci is really, really important for reconstructing some of the missing bits. Also from this donation is the one surviving notebook of Belzoni as well. So it does mean that Bristol has the crucial material relating to Belzoni, which works rather nicely in the sense that the first sort of appearance of Egyptian material in the region was from Belzoni's collection in the first place. So Sibrey continued teaching right the way through, and also he had a number of students who would later go on to have quite an important role in Egyptian archaeology. In 1900, the famous archaeologist Flinders Petrie came to lecture in Bristol and stayed with Sibrey, and he introduced him to a couple of his students, Ernest Mackay and Gerald Wainwright, who were recruited and went on to have quite important careers in field archaeology, both in Egypt and in the Near East. So the museum was getting a bit on the full side, and therefore in the early 20th century, the Art Gallery and Museum of Antiquities was added on. So this, which actually was then the University Library, there was also a drill hall in between, and it was in this area between here and the University Library, which is now the Wilton Memorial Building, that the new Art Gallery and Museum of Antiquities was built. And the upper floor was largely going to be, it was art, downstairs was antiquities, and this area, the right-hand part of the building, was dedicated to the Egyptian collection, where it's been ever since. And in fact, if you look at some of the stained glass window on the side here, you can see Egyptian motifs. Unfortunately, you can't actually see them from inside anymore because they've blacked the windows out. But there are a couple of stained glass on this side here where you can see that Egyptian motifs have been included. And so here we are. So this area here was the Egyptian collection. The museum was then further extended between then and the 1930s. So there's been quite an interesting architectural history of this part of Queen's Road. Sibrey carried on teaching Egyptian at Bristol University until 1927, when he died. In addition to being the lecturer in Oriental languages, he was also the university librarian. And so during his time, the university acquired quite a good collection of Egyptological books. Sadly, with his death, however, that rather stopped. And although Bristol University had been there for a pioneer in the teaching of the ancient Egyptian language, its involvement with the subject really fell off for a very, very long time. The only thing which was sort of left going on was work on Christian Egypt, Christian ancient Egypt, if you want to call it that. This man, De Lacy O'Leary, who was a parson out at Barton Hill, was also, however, a part-time lecturer at the university, and was responsible for doing quite a lot of important work on what we call Coptic manuscripts, which is the early Christian period of Egyptian history, and he worked quite extensively on work from a number of monasteries in Egypt. Meanwhile, in Bath, the collection which had been acquired in the middle of it from the Belzoni exhibition carried on at the Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, which moved from its original location here, what is now Bog Island in Bath, to its current position in Queen's Square. And the Egyptian material stayed there until put in storage during the Second World War, where effectively they stayed until the 1960s. Also in the interim, Bristol Museum had suffered a direct hit from Luftwaffe bombs and was burnt out. As a result, the surviving material was evacuated into the Art Gallery and Museum of Antiquities, which remained miraculously intact. The museum was never restored as a museum after the war. The plan had been that after the Second World War there'd be a new city museum, probably on Castle Park. Therefore, the burnt out museum was patched up and rented to the university as a dining hall. And then when the university bought the Hawthorns, it was then let to Brown's Restaurant, which is what it remains today. Everything was now very much crammed into the City Museum and Art Gallery, with effectively the left-hand part of the ground floor being used for the natural history material which had survived from the bombing next door, but the Egyptian material remaining where it was over here. The curator of the museum from 1952 to 1972 was Leslie Grinsell, who, although he was primarily a prehistoric British archaeologist, had been serving with the RAF in Egypt during the Second World War, and as a result actually wrote a very nice book on pyramids, which was published in 1947. In 1966, the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution material, which had not been on display since before the Second World War, was put on long-term loan to Bristol Museum, and the material moved there, including the two coffins which we started our sort of story with tonight. Unfortunately, the museum was still overcrowded. The projected new museum never happened, and as a result, in the late 1950s, Grinsell felt he had to get rid of material. And although Egyptian material is now worth a fortune, in the 1950s it really wasn't worth anything, and therefore a number of items ended up being burnt in the museum furnace simply to get rid of them. A great tragedy, because they weren't even photographed before being destroyed. But that story is repeated elsewhere, both in the UK and abroad. Say Egyptian stuff in the 50s, it wasn't trendy. Nobody wanted to buy it, and there was nothing else to do with it, unfortunately, as far as Grinsell could tell. However, that interest in matters Egyptian picked up during the 1970s, particularly owing to the Great Tutankhamun exhibition in London. And in Bristol, interest was further engendered in 1981 when the mummy of a man called Harim Kanezi was unwrapped. This was done in public with sort of live streaming of the examination, and that really was had quite an impact. And there are many Bristolians whose sort of engagement with ancient Egypt goes back to the memories of that unwrapping. This is the Egyptian Gallery, which opened about the same time as Hiram Kanase's examination took place, and that remained the display until 2005, when it was replaced by a new one. Also by that time, Bristol University had once again sort of picked up on Egyptology. First of all, Mark Horton, who, though not an Egyptologist, was an African archaeologist who worked in Egypt, became a lecturer there, and kicked off the reinstatement of some Egyptology into the curriculum. I arrived in 1996, and we've been carrying on doing not a huge amount of Egyptology, but it's certainly in the curriculum for Bristol and has been since the 1990s. And in the museum, a new gallery opened in 2007. And really, that brings us up to date as far as the engagement of Bristol and Bath with ancient Egypt is concerned. So, thank you for your attention, and happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you very much, Aidan. That was an amazing tour de force of all things Egyptian, I must say. I didn't know very much of that at all. Has anybody else? Can you put them on the chat show? That's probably the best. Most people put things on the chat. If you put your name there, we can call you to talk. Has anybody got a particular point to make? I can't see anybody waving or chatting.
Nope. Oh, hang on. Somebody waving. John Frankel waving in the middle.
You're muted, John, if you are talking.
There we are. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Have you seen the Egyptian-style gate piers on the south side of Tyndall Park Avenue?
I have never noticed them, no.
Yeah.
Given it's somewhere where I've spent a lot of the last 20 years, no, I've never noticed those.
Well, next time, walk down there. There's about 3 or 4 of them. They're fairly decayed, but they're clearly Egyptian.
Oh, right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Next time, when one is allowed back on campus again, I'll have a look.
Well, while we're on the speaker, can I ask, you showed a picture of Sibri with the old university library, a Gothic building. Where was that? And presumably it was destroyed at some stage.
Yeah, it was originally the chapel of Bristol Blind Asylum. But basically, it's underneath the Wills Memorial Building. It's basically, I think it's underneath the left-hand edge of it. So effectively, it's roughly where the museum and the Wills Memorial Building join. It's just on that juncture there. So it's a really complicated architectural history of that bit of the area, but that's basically where that was.
Okay, thanks.
There's a question on there, Aidan, from somebody saying, are there any excavations in Egypt going on that Bristol's involved in at the moment?
Sadly not. Well, actually, yeah, not directly anyway. I think there's some people who have done things who are working on them, but it's nothing actually which we're directing. Unfortunately, I'm more a museum and museum archaeologist rather than a field archaeologist. So, sadly not.
Right. I'm not sure this is a question or just a comment saying the parabolic arches of the suspension bridge would not be known in ancient Egypt.
No, absolutely not. I think that those arches, bear in mind that would have been completely covered over by the Egyptianizing bit. That the core. So what we're seeing there is simply the core, which would originally have been covered over. apparently by metal cladding was the original plan for it.
May I?
Yes, of course.
Oh, on the point of the Egyptian cladding and the bridge, Brunel, in fact, himself changed the direction of the sphinxes, and he was very, very quick to realise that a mistake had been made and turn them round, and that was done almost immediately after, indeed, the Samuel Jackson watercolour of the bridge as a whole, which you showed with them facing inwards.
Right.
That was a deliberate piece of public relations by the bridge committee, and they very quickly changed it, and most of the engravings followed the changes.
Thank you very much for that. That's useful to know. Yes, I'd never quite managed to pick that bit up, so thank you.
But I myself hadn't appreciated that the abutments themselves are so Egyptian, as you pointed out. That's fascinating.
In fact, I only realised myself when I did the we did the tour of the sort of the cavities underneath. It was only then, when you came out from that, I got close enough to realise what was there. When you're simply just looking at it from the other side of the river, you just don't really get it at all. So that was sort of a point of, sort of epiphany when I got close enough to it to realise what was going on there.
What I was also intrigued by was that the revival of interest in Egyptology in the 1860s, I think you almost call it a revival. Is that fair?
It's more the 1880s when things really kick off again.
But
when you look at various bits of Egyptomania, there's ebbs and flows of it.
The point is that Hawkshaw and Barlow, faced with the problem of finishing the bridge and what architectural style to apply to it, because there was no architectural style to the actual piers as they remained, went back to Egypt in the 1860s and did it with enormous sensitivity. In fact, they were going not back to the Brunel's original plans, but back to, I think, the idea. And it gave an extraordinary elegance to those brutal piers, which matched the great curve of the bridge itself. And that was their triumph in a way, rather than Brunel's.
I think actually, if it had been completed, the original design, it would have looked fairly awful, actually.
Oh, dreadful, yes. And one of the great bugbears of the bridge for the last 50 years has been people asking for it to be finished with the sphinxes on the top. That's a nonsense. That had been abandoned by Brunel himself long since.
Yeah, I think part, as I said, mentioned when I was talking about Egyptianising architecture, it was very rarely done properly. It was almost done as almost a caricature of Egyptian architecture. Now, in contrast, say these various other the mid-19th century architects who were desperate to make sure that their classicism was absolutely bang on, that the Gothicism was bang on. Nobody ever really wanted to try that with Egypt. It was almost a caricature of itself. So yes, I'm rather glad that isn't what came out.
I've got another question on here. Is there a list of what and how much has been destroyed over the years?
In the sense of what was destroyed in the museum, yes, there is. The register has got everything which was lost in the 50s has been annotated as such. So we know that.
Right. What else have we got? Any view on Art Deco? I'm not sure about that one.
Can I add another pair of sphinxes which were in front of the university's, the Victoria rooms? There were sphinxes there until the putting up of the statue to Edward and the great fountain itself, which saw the removal of those sphinxes. Where they went to, I do not know.
That would be interesting to try and track.
I bet they went somewhere.
Yeah, these sort of things don't these bits of sort of display sculpture normally end up in somebody's garden or some park or other, don't they? So.
Good. I think we've had a good run for our money this evening. I'd like to thank you very much, Aidan, for a most enjoyable talk. I mean, it's been a great travelogue through lots of things I didn't know about before. I can tell from all the people here they've really enjoyed it. We've kept people to the very end. We've had over 80 people this evening. So thank you very much for giving up your time and giving us such a very good presentation. And thank you
for having me.